You know, I've been getting off track lately, off the noir track. That's why today's film will be noir in a big way. It's called The Big Combo, and this may be the most visually noir film I've covered to date. The story about the story. You know, it's occurred to me that we're over 10 videos in and I still haven't explained what exactly noir is. Now, I did discuss the concept of the noir plot back in my last Let's Play, but that's no excuse. I mean, not everyone watches everything I produce. Plus, even then, what I didn't say was what noir means visually, which is kind of an oversight considering the genre is named after a color. I'd say the best way to sum up the film noir visual style is with two words: contrast and obfuscation. The plots of noir films are never black and white. They're always shades of gray, like the films themselves. The heroes are flawed, the villains are sympathetic, and the truth that drives the plot is only rarely in plain sight. A good cinematographer can translate this into a visual language, which subtly or obviously reinforces this theme. A single light source, which clearly outlines the characters while everything around them is so black it's almost invisible. Angled lights, which highlight only parts of the characters, which suggest that they may be hiding things. Dutch angles, which is to say camera angles which are slightly tilted to the left or the right, can communicate the idea that something is slightly, almost imperceptibly off. And then there's the perpetual fog, which conceals the truth just as it conceals the scenery, and conveniently hides the fact that the sets are incomplete because the production ran out of money. One big advantage that the Big Combo had was the cinematographer John Alton, one of the leading lights in a genre which, technically speaking, did not yet exist. One of his favorite lighting tricks was the singular light source. It draws the eye to the action, it provides sharp contrast, which is all you really have when you don't have color, and, perhaps just as importantly, it's fast and very cheap to set up. The Big Combo came out in 1955, and it was produced and distributed by the studio Allied Artists, which had until recently been known as Monogram Pictures. Allied Artists was a relatively stable member of Poverty Row, the tiny studios who couldn't afford their own theater chains, and thus either distributed through United Artists, or else to the small independent theaters who loved the fact that they could buy Poverty Row films on the cheap and one at a time. Monogram Pictures managed to survive from the 1930s all the way to the demise of the studio system by delivering cheap action movies and westerns. And they even managed to last past the end of the B-movie era by increasing their budgets right as television started to catch on. Technically speaking, Allied Artists is still around even today, but the company has gone through more than a few changes over the years, and it's definitely not the same company it was 60 years ago. The story. The Big Combo begins backstage at a boxing match. A woman runs away from two men, and when they catch up with her, they explain that a Mr. Brown would prefer that she watch the entire fight. She'd rather they call a cab and take her out to eat, and the two men reluctantly agree since Mr. Brown also told them to keep her happy. The camera then pans over to an old man who seems remarkably interested in the whole exchange, and so ends the first scene. We next go to the local police precinct. Captain Peterson is unhappy that Lieutenant Leonard Diamond has spent $18,600 of the department's money on the investigation of Mr. Brown, but Diamond insists that the money is well spent. Brown is both the treasurer and the head of an organized crime ring known only as the Combination, hence the title. The captain then brings up Susan Lowell, whom Leonard has had followed for 6 months. The lieutenant insists that he's doing so because she's Brown's girlfriend and a valuable lead. But when Peterson says point blank that Leonard is in love with her, he has no reply. Later on, Susan, the woman from the first scene, is having dinner at a fancy restaurant, with the two men Brown assigned as her bodyguards and handlers, Fanty and Mingo. The tall, thin one, by the way, Fanty, that's Lee Van Cleef. Susan sees an old friend of hers and asks for a dance, But in the middle of it, she says she took a lot of pills earlier and she collapses. She drops her handbag in the commotion, and so the old man, Sam, takes the opportunity to grab it. And now we cut to Mr. Brown himself, who's talking with one of the two boxers. The match is over and the boxer lost, so Brown gives him a pep talk, explaining in the process that his chief assistant, Joe McClure, used to be his boss. But Brown's in charge now because he's got more hate, more drive to be the best. In the process, Brown also points out the fact that McClure has a hearing aid. Leonard finds out from Sam that Susan is in the general hospital, and when he arrives, he and Brown posture at each other for a while. Leonard then goes in to speak with Susan, and she mentions a name, Alicia. She doesn't know who Alicia is, but she does know that she's very important to Mr. Brown, and he doesn't want to talk about her. Brown gets her out of Leonard's interrogation with a writ of habeas corpus, so Leonard's response is to arrest and interrogate literally every known member of Brown's organization, including Brown himself. Leonard puts Brown in a lie detector, a machine which detects vital signs for variations and which is secretly not very good at detecting lies. Still, Leonard does get two concrete results. When the operator says spaghetti, Brown says bettini, and the device goes wild. And when Alicia comes up, Brown lies and says it's a horse. Later on, the captain is back on Leonard's ass for the 96 false arrests. He tells Diamond to back off, but of course the next thing Leonard does is investigate the Bettini lead. Apparently the man disappeared 7 years ago, right around the same time as when the old boss, Grazi, left the combination and Brown took over. After that, Leonard goes to find Rita, a cabaret dancer and his kind of girlfriend. A friend with benefits? Somewhere around there. She seems to know that there's another woman in his life, but she's actually more supportive than she is jealous. The next day, we're with Susan and Brown. Brown's rather domineering in their relationship, and Susan's getting sick of it. Brown denies knowing anything about Alicia, and literally steals a kiss in the process. Sometime later, Rita speaks with Leonard again and warns him that he's got a price on his head. Sure enough, as soon as he leaves the cabaret, Mingo and Fanti ambush and kidnap him. In a rather intense scene, Brown, McClure, Mingo, and Fanti interrogate Leonard about Alicia in a way that's carefully designed to not leave a mark. Specifically, they torture him by using McClure's hearing aid and a radio turned all the way up. And then they practically drown him in alcoholic hair tonic, so that when they dump him next to Captain Peterson's apartment, it looks like he just got wasted. Still, Lieutenant Diamond tells them nothing. As Leonard recovers, he mentions Bettini to the captain, who, as it turns out, is familiar with the name. Peterson explains that Bettini changed his name and went into hiding it when Brown took over, and the captain knows where he is because Bettini did the cops a couple of favors right before the end. When Leonard tracks him down, Bettini is certain that he's there to kill him, but Diamond sets him straight and then asks about Alicia. Turns out, Alicia was Brown's wife, but 2 years into their marriage, she became an alcoholic, and Brown murdered her. They were on Grazi's boat at the time, and Alicia pushed him too far. She disappeared partway through their transatlantic voyage, and Bettini figures Brown tied her to the boat anchor since the captain had to get a new one when they stopped by the Azores. Bettini can't remember the captain's name, and only remembers that he was some Swede, but when he's about to leave to go into protective custody, Bettini suggests that a boat captain who keeps his mouth shut might be able to buy a store's worth of antiques. And the camera pans over to an ad for Nils Dreyer Antiques. And since the ad is in Bettini's apartment, I can only figure that he was lying when he said he didn't remember. Leonard goes to Dreyer's place and asks him about the anchor purchase, which he's apparently looked up in the meantime. Dreyer claims that he remembers nothing, so Diamond then brings up the fact that Dreyer got his initial investment from one of Mr. Brown's shell companies. Leonard offers Dreyer police protection, but Dreyer keeps his mouth shut. He does, however, get a gun out of his desk drawer before he leaves, and just after he goes out the door, someone shoots Dreyer 5 times. Brown is very unhappy when he hears the news. He wanted to move Dryer, not kill him, and all McClure can say is, "He pulled a gun on me, what could I do?" Brown thinks McClure is trying to sabotage him, and warns him to stop thinking about replacing him. We now cut back to Leonard, who finds a film negative in Dryer's safety deposit box, a negative which depicts Alicia on Grazzi's boat. As he considers what it means, he realizes Dryer may have had more information in his shop. But when he gets there, Brown has already burnt the store's records. Legally, as it turns out, since ownership of the shop and its contents defaulted to Brown as the part owner after Dryer died. So Leonard goes to Susan, who's taking in a piano concert. He asks her to leave Mr. Brown, but she tells him she can't. So he gives her a copy of the photo of Alicia and leaves. She finds Brown in her apartment and asks him about his wife. And at the same time, Brown shows her his hidden room of guns and money, which is in her apartment, by the way, because he owns the building and his place would have been too obvious. Brown says that Alicia is alive and in Sicily with Grazzi, and that she left Brown for his old boss. He even shows her a recent photo. That night, Rita goes up to Leonard's place to wait for him to finish at work, and we also find out that Mingo and Fanti apparently live together and sleep in the same room. Now, I'm not saying they have to be gay because they're roommates, but it would explain why Brown trusts them with guarding his girlfriend, and a later scene makes more sense if, in fact, they are. Anyway, Brown orders the two of them to kill Lieutenant Diamond, but since Rita is in his apartment alone, she dies instead. To say the least, Leonard is very upset when he finds out. The next morning, Susan comes to the station and says she's left Mr. Brown. She doesn't have any evidence about Rita's murder, but she does have that photo Brown showed to her. Leonard instantly realizes that the photo isn't from Sicily thanks to snow on the ground and an interstate highway sign in the background. The lieutenant also realizes that since Alicia wasn't the murder victim, Grazzi, the old mob boss, was, and Alicia must be a witness. The police identify the highway marker number, and it leads them to an asylum in the country. Sure enough, there's Alicia, pretending to be someone else. Leonard confronts her with her past, and also with the fact that Brown killed Rita. And although she doesn't want to hear any of it, he takes her into custody. Turns out McClure was following the police, and so he goes to Mingo and Fanti to say that Brown's finished and that they should get rid of him as a favor to the organization. However, the henchmen are more loyal to Brown than to McClure, because when the time comes for the double cross, McClure is the one they shoot. And in a very brilliant move, Brown pulls out McClure's hearing aid and the soundtrack just stops. The next day, Susan and Alicia have a very awkward meeting where Susan explains her relationship to Brown. Leonard confronts Alicia again with Rita's death, and she agrees to act as a witness. Then Brown shows up with another writ, and seeing him in person again is enough to send Alicia to the hospital. 2 days later, Fanti and Mingo are hiding out in an old Prohibition wine cellar. Brown stops by to give them some food, some money, and an escape plan, but when they open the cash box, it turns out to contain a bomb. And unfortunately for Brown, the bomb doesn't kill Mingo. That said, he is not in very good shape, and while he initially refuses to say anything, he breaks down in tears when Leonard shows him that Fanti is dead. As Mingo puts it, he'll tell the truth not for Leonard, but for Fanti. Meanwhile, Brown has become desperate. When Sam and Susan are going up to her room for that gun closet, Brown shoots the cop and abducts the girl. When Leonard finds out, he goes to Alicia and asks her where Brown would go. And after some more convincing, she explains that Brown has a private plane on standby specifically so he can bug out in situations like this. However, Leonard shows up in time to delay the pilot and confront Brown, and he taunts the mob boss into shooting all 6 of his bullets into the thick atmospheric fog while Susan keeps him spooked by shining a spotlight on him. Diamond only approaches once Brown's revolver is empty, and he takes him in alive because, for Brown, that's a fate worse than death. The movie ends with Leonard and Susan walking off into the fog. Final thoughts. Overall, I'd say that The Big Combo is basically the inverse of DOA. DOA has an amazing premise and a tightly built plot, but it was let down by subpar dialogue and a cast who didn't really do much with their roles. Conversely, The Big Combo has a fairly stock script with a few predictable twists and turns, but the actors put in some remarkably memorable performances, and every one of them gets at least one moment to really shine. And the cinematography, mwah! DOA's director may have known what he was doing, but John Alton was turning black and white films into moving artworks. Something else I'd like to touch on is that relationship between the two henchmen, Fanti and Mingo. So you remember back when I covered Rebel Without a Cause, how I said that queer studies critics would read a homosexual subtext into the relationship between Plato and Jim? Well, there's a reason why queer studies critics in particular tend to jump at shadows like that. It's because, in a lot of these old movies, there really are things hidden in plain sight. While the Hays production office may have said that homosexuality doesn't exist, the actors and the filmmakers knew better. Throughout the golden age of Hollywood, films would often include what are now referred to as coded gay characters. Characters who probably would have told you that they're about as straight as a slinky if anyone had bothered to ask. The Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz is widely considered a classic example of this. The film in general is often cited as a homosexual Bildungsroman, but The Cowardly Lion in particular is a self-proclaimed sissy and a fop. His makeover in Oz consists of getting a pretty red bow in his hair, and he has some very particular body language, and some lines you can rather easily read some extra meanings into. Or how about Joe Cairo and the Maltese Falcon? Like I said back in that review, Cairo was about as openly gay as you could expect from a book written in the 1920s, and the first film adaptation also wasn't very subtle about his sexual preferences. But while the 1941 version had to remove a lot of that thanks to the Hays Code, it's not entirely gone. Peter Lorre's Cairo is clearly a fop who spends a lot of his time on his appearance and carries around a scented handkerchief and scented business cards. And during his introduction, Laurie does some pretty suggestive things with his cane. That said, Hollywood depictions of homosexuality, subtextual or otherwise, were rarely as positive as The Cowardly Lion until very recently. Far from it, in fact. Really, the best you could hope for would be someone like Cairo or the two henchmen in this movie. Villains who aren't entirely unsympathetic and whose homosexuality has no real bearing on why they're villainous. Fanti and Mingo are gay. They work for a mob boss, and these are two separate things. More often, you'd see coded gay homosexual characters who are mentally disturbed, who are either suicidal social outcasts, or who are actively villainous and display stereotypically gay behaviors as an aspect of that villainy. After all, one easy way to pump up the masculinity of the hero is for the bad guy to be as effeminate as possible. Worked for Aladdin. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for the other big film noir about a man, a woman, her husband, and his life insurance policy.